Welcome to Auditor Training 2020 Aerospace Module 2 with Aaron Troshinetz. So as this module unfolds, we have a number of topics that we'll be going through. First, an introduction to the purpose behind Module 2, because I think it's important that we kind of calibrate on some concerns that we've had as of recent involving different reporting deficiencies, areas that we need to correct moving forward. We'll then dive into the AS supplemental report, some of the supporting SQA requirements. We'll then talk about AS forms review, similar exercise to what we did last year, but with some additional areas of concern and auditor reminders. And then finally, we'll end with some important AQMS procedure references. I think it's important that SQA AQMS auditors understand that we have a number of procedures that you should be familiar with as it pertains to conducting the audit and supporting requirements. So an introduction into Module 2. We have clearly observed some resurfacing of some previous reporting issues into our AQMS package review process. That is why Module 2 is specifically designed to hopefully account for some of those issues and provide appropriate guidance. Now, some of this could be attributable to the new staff that we have, new auditors, but we want to take this opportunity overall. I think it's important we continually calibrate ourselves as part of these trainings to tighten our reporting back into conformance with the various AQMS requirements. Many of the items that we're going to talk about as part of this module have remained unchanged within either AS 9101F or AS 9104-1. I would strongly encourage for any of you taking this module, if you have any questions, concerns, to please reach out to me. Again, I do think it's important that as we go through these sessions, we're continually calibrating and keeping in mind that these reporting items are things that we need to be mindful of as we conduct our audits. So let's start with the AS supplemental report and some of the supporting SQA requirements. So it all starts with audit pre-planning. This is reference SQA 128 and the supporting process. Current revision is February 8th, 2019, so that document has not been changed in the last 12 months or so. Some items I would point out on this. First of all, this is a document that the ASOSC, or DANA, sends this as part of the initial audit setup with the client. The AQMS auditor then should be ensuring it is appropriately received back and used as an input into the audit activity, in particular with the red circle areas we have here. So the first one on the left is ITAR requirements. Obviously, we always want to be mindful of any supporting ITAR requirements and appropriately considering that into our plan. The next circled item pertains to business condition information. And there's a lot of specific questions that we're asking the client in this section that could be pertinent to where we take various audit trails. Just some examples that I would point out. The first one, negative spikes in quality or delivery performance. That's certainly something we want to know in advance. Any change with the management rep. We see that from time to time. Any decrease in business. And maybe those are audit trails we go down as to how it's affected various processes within the client's overall AQMS. So continuing on with pre-planning, some additional sections. So the section 3 is very important. This is where we get into the aerospace customers. This is a requirement of AS 9101F in that we need to have this information. So the common aerospace customers we see, obviously Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Goodrich, Textron, so on. So we want to understand what is their current on-time delivery, what is their PPM level as it pertains to any issues that we should be conducting appropriate follow-ups on. And then the next item is certificate structure. most of our clients are single site organizations, but for those that are not single site, so those would be at this time several site, multiple site, or campus, we need to understand that we are continually verifying that certificate structure is correct, because there are times where, for instance, a campus can fall out of a campus and more appropriately be identified as a several site. We have had that issue happen in the past. So we need to ensure that we're continually verifying that. We're making sure that the justification as provided by the client supports the certificate structure being identified, and having that documented in the pre-planning ensures that if we have to make any changes, that we're doing those well in advance of the audit activity. So finishing up on the audit pre-planning, important item to add here. So these are basic fields that the client provides their comments as part of the pre-planning information. The expectation is that in the following comment or column, that the auditor is also providing their comments. So this is that input into the audit plan itself that needs to happen. So if we're identifying issues as part of the pre-planning, that we can ensure that that gets in the audit plan with appropriate follow-up. The other item I would add to this is that if we do not receive this information, the expectation is that we're adding on-time site appropriately at time of the audit being conducted. So we have run into issues as described in Module 1 where pre-audit planning information was not available. Some of that could include up to this form being completed. So it is absolutely imperative that as auditors, you're completing this well in advance of the audit, getting the information you need to ensure that your plan covers and addresses any issues potentially that could be incurred as part of the on-site activity. So let's talk about the comprehensive workbook. This document has remained unchanged. You can see the current revision is the same since February 10th, 2016. This is a very important document, and I think one at times that we tend to take for granted. Now, the maintenance of this document itself, the completion of this document is a client responsibility. But what this tool is intended to do over the course of our audits and over the course of time is to ensure that we're covering all the applicable requirements as identified by the client. We're working with the client as to having this as part of our audit activity and ensuring that our process coverage aligns with what they have identified on this form. So as you go through your audit pre-planning, this is one of those documents that you should have right by your side in terms of understanding to process name, what precisely am I covering in terms of clause requirements? I think we should not make the assumption that just because we think we know what the process should include, that that's actually what it should include per the client. And we have incurred issues with that at times where maybe the auditor made an assumption that by virtue of the process name being production, that for instance, certain clauses were included, but that's not always the case because as we know, our clients have the ability to identify their processes. That's not our job to identify what's inclusive within a given process. That is the client's responsibility. So again, very important to consider the CRW as it pertains to an input into your audit plan. Now moving on to the audit plan, and this is the SQA 45, current revision, November 10th, 2017. A couple of items we need to tighten up on this. So one of the sections that we quite frequently see not filled out within the audit plan is under the note section involving all shifts are to be audited. Now, if all shifts are not audited, the expectation is that justification will be provided. So if we look at surveillance audit, all shifts are not required to be audited, but the expectation is still a justification is being provided as to why you are selecting the given shifts to be audited and how you will ensure that all shifts are covered throughout the surveillance audit cycle appropriately. Now, in the case of recertification, or initial for that matter, all shifts are required to be audited. So that note should be pretty simple. I mean, all shifts as required are covered within this audit plan, or something to that effect. A couple more items in regards to the audit plan. So in Module 1, we did talk about misalignment of AS and ISO scopes. So we do require that the auditor list within the audit plan the AS certificate scope as well as the ISO certificate scope. Those should be aligned. If they are not aligned, the expectation is we are doing a separate ISO add-on activity, because as we explained in Module 1, due to the ICOP Resolution 155, those need to be in complete harmony. So this is an opportunity for us to confirm in advance of the audit, this is the scope we have for you. Obviously, if the client took any exception to the scope we had listed, that would be an opportunity for us to have a discussion. Again, hopefully well in advance of the on-site audit activity. Another additional item is the additional check sheets. So we do have here at SQA a requirement for specific IEF codes. As you can see, the ones listed here: electronics, engineering services, chemicals, med devices would be covered elsewhere, obviously. But for those three IF codes, as it pertains to any AS clients, there are additional forms required with the SQA 63, 66, or 77. So at time of submission, those forms should be provided as part of the overall audit package being submitted for the office review. And then as far as the agenda itself, you know, we have a couple of different versions of auditors using the audit plan, but again, it comes down to making sure that the audit times are clear, making sure that any additional shift coverage is noted. And certainly I would recommend as well, because I know a couple of auditors do this as a best practice, denoting the pairs within your audit plan. And I think what that provides for the client is a clear expectation of where the pairs are to be covered and with which corresponding processes that they may be appropriate for. Now, in regards to the supplemental report, this is SQA 67. The current version is July 6, 2019. So again, not much has changed on this form for some time. A couple of items I would highlight here: pre-audit data. We do have a requirement for the auditor to acknowledge, was pre-audit data covered off-site or on-site? So obviously we get most of our packages in with off-site, but then that begs the question, when we're not able to procure the pre-audit data, was it really effectively conducted off-site? So we're looking for that box to be marked accordingly on the form, and in the event it was covered on-site, then the expectation would be more time would be added appropriately. In the case of all supplemental reports, a review of the use of the mark is required. And we give some examples here: web pages, we talked about that in Module 1, brochures, stationery, business cards. This could also include, we ran into an issue recently with certificate of conformance reports or COC reports. We've also run into issues with packaging, including the mark. So as always, you have the marketing guidelines document that can provide you additional guidance in those situations. But I would also encourage you, if you're ever uncertain as to whether the use of the SQA mark is appropriate, to be contacting the office for appropriate support. We also have included in the SQA 67, and this is a very important section for the back office, is changes to the organization. So what this allows us to do is quickly run through the report with any particular changes that would be of a concern for back office processing. So these would include things like the total audit days, certificate scope, any name or address changes that we need to be mindful of. So once again, with auditors, it's important to be completing this information appropriately and alerting the office if any changes have occurred that require support. So finishing up on the supplemental report, there is an assessment summary log. Very important section. This is actually a requirement of ISO 1721-1 in that we're clearly outlining the plan and the achievement to plan for appropriate coverage of certain requirements. Now, some of these are outlined in AS 9100. Some of them are SQA specific or otherwise supported by 1721. But the expectation is, at least for the gray items, that those are covered as part of every assessment appropriately. And then in the bottom section, the non-gray highlighted section, we have a clear understanding of where processes were covered in respect to audit. So let's dig into AS forms review. These are a series of items from OASIS. All these items should look pretty familiar from the last auditor training, but again, a couple of additional items worth considering in terms of completing the forms in OASIS. So stage 1 audit report, very important, some items to note here. So where we are providing any not applicable clauses, we always need to support with justification. So in this case here on the far left, where we have 8.3 noted as not applicable, this is not sufficient information. This is not telling us as to why we've arrived at the justification, no design control or authority. Is this based on the fact that they manufacture the customer prints? Is there a particular customer that ultimately has design responsibility? We need more information in this particular example. The next item is in regards to any sections that are noted within the stage 1 report or form 1 as N, we need to ensure that they're supplied with comments. Now, these comments do give us a clear reference to specific client documentation, what the auditor may have looked at within these given sections. So it's important to have that information as part of the review with the form 1 or stage 1 audit report. And then for any areas of concern, this is the last circled section, it is important to note a follow-through with items relative to the stage 2. Again, we talked about this in module 1. We need to ensure that we have that follow-on. Any identified issues within the stage 1 have to be followed on to the stage 2 for appropriate closure and addressing of those issues. So let's move on to form 2. This is the QMS process matrix. Again, important to note with any N entries that we need to ensure that we're providing the correct NCR reference and name. In this particular example, this one did not match up with the NCR. So there is an NCR name within the NCR report, which does not support that particular clause or the citing of that nonconformance. So very important we have that alignment from those two documents. For the summary of objective evidence section, we have admittedly had a lot of conversation with this over the course of time with ANAB and other interested parties. But the bottom line here is in this section, there should be some clear reference to support the C's or N's basically above. And this should provide some insight or detail into the audit trail, what was looked at in terms of samples or records. And in this case, this would meet the requirements in terms of providing that sufficient additional objective evidence as to what was looked at. So moving on to Form 3, this is the Process Effectiveness Assessment Report, or PAIR. We need to make sure that we're always noting the applicable, the appropriate not applicables. So for the appropriate not applicables, again, this is the alignment exercise, making sure that all of it aligns from the audit plan to the CRW to any of the affected pairs. We need to make sure that we're keeping mind of our not applicables and ensuring alignment overall. The next item is in regards to method for determining process effective needs. This section needs to be focused on the how. And I know for some auditors, this continues to be a discussion. but we need to understand how the client is specifically measuring these things with more detail than what's being provided below. So this could include various methods in terms of data collection, how they review the data itself, but there needs to be more information typically provided in this section. And then the last item here is providing supporting comments in both the process results as well as the additional section. So in the process results, if we look at that in terms of the comments, it's okay as far as goal met, no additional action required. But if we were seeing cases of KPIs not being met, the expectation would be that there would be a clear reference to what the client organization was doing or what the auditor specifically observed as not sufficient. And then in the final additional comment section, that should be a clear and concise statement as to what was looked at, if there were any NCRs cited appropriately to support the rating above as far as the pair. So moving on to the nonconformity report. So very important with the nonconformity report, we continue to have some date issues. So we need to watch our dates. The same requirements apply that have remained in effect with the NCR report. That's 7-day containment, 14-day response, 30-day acceptance by the auditor, and 60 days NCR close. So those dates should follow that timing. We have had cases where timing is missed, and it's important that we're following that appropriately. Next item is root cause. Root cause has bit us a couple of times during office audits, review of files. The question we should always be asking ourselves is there another why? You know, in this particular case, we have a procedure being cited. Previous quality director did not revise the form. The question I would have is there another why there? Is there a case where something wasn't established as part of the process that allowed this deficiency or gap to happen? So this particular example definitely needs some more detail, some more consideration as to what is the true root cause of this underlying issue. And then the last item is the auditor verification. So we have been seeing an increase in canned examples with auditor verification comments. It's important that these details and comments are specific to the NCR above, and they provide a clear picture of what was reviewed and accepted as a means of recommendation for closure of the NCR. So I would tell you as auditors to make those as specific as possible relative to the objective evidence provided so that we can consider whether or not the NCR is in fact fully addressed and closed appropriately. So last but not least, the Form 5 audit report. So a couple items with this. So audit scopes, and I know we've had this discussion before, the difference between audit objectives and audit scopes, but audit scopes must include extent and boundaries of the audit. So this includes physical locations, organization units, activities, processes to be audited. This particular example does not provide that. So what we need to see in these particular examples is some reference to the physical location, i.e. address, and any of the processes audited as part of the audit activity. The next item here is verification of effectiveness, and this pertains to previous NCRs. So for this one, and this discussion has happened with a number of file reviews, we need to understand what was specifically reviewed in relation to that given NCR. And again, this is another section that we have to be very careful with canned statements because they do not provide that level of detail. So the question being asked here specifically is what was reviewed to allow you to make the determination that that NCR remains effectively closed. So we would expect to see reference to objective evidence, reference to a file, maybe records reviewed, something that supports the closure of that NCR, and the allowance for it to be considered closed at time of next audit. So just one more item as far as the Form 5 audit report. AS forms, we talked about this at the last auditor training. Unfortunately, at this time, do not satisfy all the requirements of 1721-1. We have had this issue during at least one office audit. We had a discussion with ANAB. They are certainly well aware of it, but unfortunately in their current design and condition, there are gaps with 1721. As such, within the audit conclusion section, the following statements must be made, and this is in alignment with ISO 1721-1 9483. And these statements include: the QMS organization's approach to continual improvement appears effective. So making that determination, is it effective, ineffective? The QMS appears capable in meeting applicable requirements and expected outcomes. That's in direct reference to an ANAB heads up on expected outcomes, which many of you know we covered during our opening and closing meeting. There were no deviations from the audit plan. The expectation would be, if there are deviations from the audit plan, they're noted appropriately. There were no significant issues impacting the audit program. That needs to be another statement included as to an assessment of their audit program itself. There were no unresolved issues identified. That's the whole issue of ensuring closure and closing of the loop. A review on the appropriate use of certificate and marks was performed and found acceptable. Again, that's a reference back to SQA 67. Internal audits and management reviews appear to be effective. That is a requirement right out of 1721-1. Certificate scope was determined to be appropriate. And finally, all audit objectives, again, as referenced up in the section in Form 5, were fulfilled. So to end, some important AQMS procedure reference. And if you haven't familiarized yourself with these documents, I would strongly encourage you to take a moment to consider them. So the first one here is kind of our core document, which talks about conducting AS 9100, essentially assessments overall. This is CQAM 110. I provided a link to the document. This is kind of our core document in terms of conducting the audits, any appropriate AS 9101F or AS 9104-1 requirements. It's pretty comprehensive, but I think you'll find it provides a lot of helpful information in terms of conducting the audit. And then the last document is estimating time required to perform assessment activity for the AQMS AS 9100 requirements. This is CQAM 016.5. And what this document entails is detailing out all of our audit tables, all the required times as far as supporting audit activities. So that concludes Module 1. I would like to take an opportunity to thank you for making the time to view this module. There will be post this module an exam required for completion of this training. And as always, if you have any questions, concerns, by all means, let me know. Thank you.